So thank you all for coming again. Please invite your friends. We want this platform to encourage the kind of debate and discourse that leads to meaningful change. The stakes are very high right now. And people like Hannah and Astra Taylor, who we had last week, and Fred Moten and Silvia Federici, who we've had in our real life discussions at the lab, really kind of usher in the kind of conversations and discourse that we need to be having. So please, we ask that you help us, any of the attendees and participants in this debate, like really help us to understand what that change might look like. So we are so excited and happy to have artist and writer Hannah Black with us today. She will be speaking about some of the solidarity projects that are happening during this crisis. So she's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers following the talk. But I keep inviting people to use that space as a space to propose arguments, propose ideas, propose actions for meaningful change, and to see what Hannah kind of, from her understanding and expertise, thinks that might work. So with that conversation and that discourse, we can actually start building solidarity. So thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you. There's been like my worst fear, which is serious internet service outages in the UK on the service provider I'm on, so they suddenly disappeared. That's probably why. I had like really high ambitions for this talk being really like well structured, but I'm having like a kind of misery day, or I've had a couple of like misery days in a row, but which we can now all be like super open about because it's the pandemic, so it's a little bit it's a bit more exploratory, but that actually reflects the real conditions of my own sort of condition of like political and intellectual inquiry at this moment anyway, so I guess it's more honest. So basically I kind of wanted to, so I've been thinking about there's some kind of emerging set of possibilities that are kind of building on existing possibilities, which is around the prospect of what you could call a kind of like politics of militant care. And the main substance of the concrete examples that I might touch on are mostly drawn from rent strike and some mutual aid stuff. I was hoping to include some labor organizing stuff, but that's something that I'm not myself particularly directly involved in, and I'm only like very peripherally involved in that, so I've kind of left that to one side, but obviously labor organizing is super important as well. So what's basically happened as the pandemic's been taking hold is that all social resources have been converted to the task of reproducing society. So the resources of society are now directed towards continuing the existence of society. We're in a kind of survival situation, and that's kind of interesting because in terms of certain visions of like the future of a kind of a revolutionary politic or a kind of radical politic that, for example, the kind of communist idea, the much misunderstood communist idea of dictatorship of the proletariat, which sounds scary because it's got dictatorship in it, but that's kind of intended to mean a situation in which, again, the resources of the social are directed towards kind of like reproducing people, kind of reproducing the proletariat, which just refers to people who don't own capital, kind of don't own land, and are not capitalists, are kind of reliant on the wage and kind of other effects to kind of continue to live. So so this is like a weird situation. There was a really striking description of it in a blog called Chuang, which is like a kind of Anglophone communist blog by people based in China that I'll get to in a minute. But what the current so the current situation is one where, you know, everything's social resources are kind of converted to the task of reproduction, and this is a huge shock for capital. This is like not what people want to be happening, and not what capitalists want to be happening. And what it makes very evident is that capitalism is reliant on workers and on labor, and it's reliant on workers both as the vessels of labor power and also as consumers. And the reason I wanted to kind of like point that out is that there's been a sort of like miasma of like I think kind of like structurally liberal kind of conspiracy theories, or theories or whatever. Maybe conspiracy theories is derogatory, but theories that I think kind of miss that out to some extent. This is really a problem because there's two sources of value. This is like classic Marx, probably a lot of you know it. Two sources of value only, labor and nature. So and they haven't fixed that problem yet. There are no robots that can produce capitalist value in that sense. And actually things that kind of appear like huge like technologizations kind of actually tend to sort of rely on kind of like still rely on labor in the kind of normal way. So yeah, so this isn't like in the state's interests, and that's obviously been made pretty clear in the American context, where you've got, or in lots of contexts where you get this kind of polarization of like staying at home versus going back to work along like left and right lines, which is kind of interesting and wasn't immediately evident from the beginning, but it's kind of how things have shaken out. And that is because, you know, bosses need people to be working to produce value. So, I mean, obviously everyone knows this, whatever. But this reliance on labor is kind of how capital has fused itself to the join between life and death. In this sense, I mean, I have a very like perhaps idiosyncratic understanding of some of this stuff. Something I got kind of attached to was something I received from the writer Evan Calder Williams, who kind of talks about how like you can't negotiate with a machine. So say you have a business and you need machines and you need workers, like you can't really negotiate in terms of like the fixed costs of running there's fixed costs of running the business. Like the machine costs a certain amount. If it breaks, you have to pay a certain amount to have it repaired and so on. You can't really negotiate with it. If it's broken, it's just broken. Whereas in the situation of workers are people who to quote the title of a book, do mind dying, kind of. So that it's actually this, that people's kind of sensitivity to and awareness of the distinction between life and death, and people's sensitivity to their survival and the survival of people that they care about, that kind of makes us in some ways vulnerable to capitalist extraction. So it's kind of capital has sort of fused itself to this join between life and death, this kind of like liminal or threshold state, and kind of secularized it by making it value producing. So what could have been considered a kind of sacred distinction or kind of zone of overlap or whatever. And then what's intervened into that, which I think is kind of interesting, is a virus, and a virus is neither dead nor alive. So it's kind of an interesting situation for this this kind of problem. God, it's so weird just talking into nothing. It's so weird. Anyway, so and I guess another thing I've been thinking, sorry, this is going to be kind of messy, but we will get to some concrete examples, I promise. So I guess there's the conditions of massive flux, and I really appreciated a friend's phrase that he used recently. He called it these convulsions of the social body, like we're in this like convulsing social body, and we can really feel that. So these conditions kind of seem to presage two things, or two simultaneous possibilities, right? Like one is that we're going to have this complete terraforming of the terrain of politics, like new things, never before seen things might become possible. And as we get into the examples, I think this becomes really clear, because you know, I remember on May Day last year thinking like, what a depressing day to be in New York. I went to like a wage theft protest uptown, and then I went to like some kind of like rally, and I left really early because I was just like, this is very like uninspiring or whatever. And then this May Day, we're really looking at not only possible kind of a series of wildcat strikes around the country, but also and sorry, when I say the country, I mean America. It's confusing because I have an English accent. I'm currently in England. I'm stuck here for a while anyway, but I usually live in New York, and still kind of feel like more attached to that situation somehow. But anyway, so this year we're looking at a situation of like massive wildcat strikes all around the country, and then possibly possibly like, you know, like a general rent strike, which is truly extraordinary, and is now almost, it's amazing how quickly we kind of become used to these new conditions, and we kind of normalize some things that are quite extraordinary. So one thing that seems to be possible right now is this complete transformation in what's like the conditions of political possibility. My internet connection is unstable, so I apologize if I suddenly disappear. And the second thing is a kind of peristatic closure of reaction. You know, like when people use that phrase like reactionary, it's like reaction. It's like the reaction of the ruling class as it like moves to like shut everything down and shut down all these possibilities. And that's like a really alive struggle right now, those two possibilities. And to quote myself, which is maybe a bit like gauche or whatever, like obviously the kind of possibility of even conceiving of apocalypse and utopia has to be held in some form in the present. So apocalypse is already with us, utopia is already with us, and in the same way these two possibilities are kind of being worked out now and are being kind of shaped now, and they're not only kind of future horizons. So when we talk about horizons and limits, we're also talking about what we're currently experiencing. So what's interesting, so the instability in some ways resembles a revolutionary condition, but it's interesting that it's not actually one, in some ways it's not brought about by a revolutionary left. So because what's happened in recent years, and I think this is partly in response, I mean, there's lots of alignments between the US and the UK in this way, to the extent it does seem like a kind of almost formal set of responses or whatever. So you had 2016 in the UK, there was Brexit, and in the US there was the election of Trump, and that was quite shocking to many people. It was quite kind of like, I mean, obviously now we all have to say we're not surprised by anything, but I think it did represent quite a sharp kind of a kind of turn rightward in the sense of, at least not, maybe not of the fundamental conditions of how we live, but of the kind of appearances and the kind of some sort of legislative aspects of how we're living. So so that happened, and then I think there was a kind of, out of almost desperation and a feeling, and then a lot of this, and around that same time, a lot of social movements that had been quite exciting were crushed. Black Lives Matter, which was obviously it's a very like loose network of kind of affinities, but if you kind of there was this kind of incredible uprisings that happened in Ferguson and other places in 2014, and in reaction to police violence, and pre Olympics in London in 2011, there was the riots and so on. So there's these kind of, and there was Arab Spring. There was a series of extraordinary uprisings, and those were really repressed. And then you had this kind of retreat of the left into the electoral. So what's kind of interesting is that the moment of a kind of revolutionary turmoil has kind of come in a situation where people, myself included, have been pretty invested in some ways in the Bernie Sanders campaign. I've been working on that. That obviously came to an end. I mean, it's still possible that some form that like Medicare for all could be still kind of fought for and might come through at state level. But I mean, that's kind of being proposed by like left-leaning and socialist candidates. But it, the campaign itself came to an end. So we're facing this, what feels like a kind of revolutionary situation, but without a kind of recent history of revolutionary activity in some ways. As we've sort of like taken the poison chalice of like the path of the electoral, which and I guess there's a sort of temptation to kind of make kind of absolute judgments about like, does this prove that the gate of the electoral is just like too narrow to pass through? And it does seem like, yeah, in some ways, in other ways, in terms of like local elections, down ballot elections, people are using it for kind of transformative purposes. So I guess it's a question that never quite kind of heals over, never quite closes over or whatever, because new conditions arrive. Sorry, I feel like yeah, it's weird. I guess there's a sort of performative dimension to this kind of talk, even though it seems kind of whatever, theoretical, and any performance kind of relies on a certain amount of like audience feedback. So it's a really strange situation to be in. But anyway, I wanted to quote this thing from the blog Trying that I mentioned earlier, that's like based in China, because I think this is really felt really true at the time of reading. So they say, in a strange way, the subjective experience of lockdown and so on is somewhat like that of a mass strike, but one which, in its non-spontaneous top-down character, and especially in its involuntary hyper-atomization, illustrates the basic conundrums of our own strangled political present as clearly as the true mass strikes of the previous century elucidated the contradictions of their era. The quarantine, then, is like a strike hollowed of its communal features, but nonetheless capable of delivering a deep shock to both psyche and economy. And I think since I've read that, that has kind of been filled, that to some extent, the hollow mass strike has been filled in by actual strike, which is kind of interesting. Like people have sort of like moved into the kind of breach in social conditions that's been created. So it does kind of feel as if the horror conditions of the pandemic have brought about kind of, plausible new, quite striking new political coalitions. You can imagine sort of like local, like DSA approved candidates and campaigns, plus the remnants of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which has to an extent been converted into a kind of at least sort of like fundraising for kind of mutual aid efforts and so on, plus like militant tenant unions, some of them quite new, again, like militant labor unions. Labor unions is complex because obviously there's been this like massive institutionalization, and the situation of labor and of organized labor in the US is quite bad. But I think that's why the kind of wildcat and kind of like newly forming kind of strike possibilities we're seeing now are really cool and interesting, is because they in some ways kind of evade that like ossification that's happened in some aspects of labor struggles or whatever. Anyway, so this is kind of amazing, right? Like, I don't think this is something that people like saw. I mean, of course, like no one or very few people saw this coming, and in terms of the pandemic, and I think also people didn't see coming this kind of like new resurgence of actually quite like active and militant and kind of networked left in a broad sense, or like people kind of dedicated to the task of like revolutionary transformation. But it's hard to take, you know, we can't take pleasure in that. In some ways, the pleasure is always, because there's always this kind of swinging between, or I found at least this kind of swinging between a kind of like excitement and joy of like the possibilities of the situation, and then a kind of like obviously like the sadness at the conditions of death all around, like the kind of intensities of who that's affecting, you know, like low income people, mainly Black people. That's true, again, true not only in America, which so you get this really terrible activation of terrible histories we've been living in for so long, and at the same time this sense of political possibility, and that is quite a difficult thing to kind of oscillate between at times. But it does kind of make me think of how arguably the content of the politics of profound social transformation always kind of comes from like outside the conscious operation of what you could refer to as like capital P politics. And this is something obviously in many cases, this is common in the kind of like left of the left or whatever, is when we talk about strike, we might reach back to like W.B. Du Bois's like concept of general strike in his book Black Reconstruction, and he also has spoken about the Haitian Revolution in similar terms. He calls these upheavals of humanity, and that's, you know, and he describes this, you know, so in the specific case of the general strike chapter of Black Reconstruction, he kind of describes how the original kind of political logic of the Civil War didn't really include abolition. Even Lincoln was, I mean, probably a lot of people know this, Lincoln wasn't for abolition. It was actually the spontaneous movement of enslaved people who just like got up and in many cases just like walked, just like got up and left their situation and went to look for a better one or whatever. And that was the kind of pressure that, and then became absorbed into the armies of the North and so on or whatever. I mean, obviously most of you probably know this even better than I do, but the point is it was a kind of spontaneous movement, and it wasn't necessarily something that had been already kind of prefigured politically in terms of the kind of like white mainstream of capital P politics or whatever. And but I think this is often so this Du Boisian vision of general strike, which is quite special, is you know, and this is the real kind of engine of profound historical change, of not just sort of like a reorganization of the decks on the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, but like profound transformation kind of comes from this like outside that maybe appears as like incoherent, or it appears as like not correctly political, and so or like chaotic or disorganized, or like or not happening kind of enough from the will or the intention or whatever, not like planned. And this is the real fun of like politics or whatever, and this so this is something, and that so this is sometimes used to kind of defend Du Bois's kind of theories about this, are sometimes used to kind of defend a like totally spontaneous, totally insurrectionist kind of vision of like the revolution, where it's like we'll just kind of like spontaneously riot, and that will somehow kind of cohere in some way that no one knows how. And then, but you know, but obviously Du Bois himself wasn't like anti-organization. He was someone who was involved in political organizations. But this question has become quite acute in some phases of in some areas of like discussion around rent strike. So it's probably like everyone knows, like a lot of people are going to pay their rent for April, a lot more people are not going to pay their rent for the 1st of May, and what this represents is like that. Then that's just factual, right? I mean, we've all seen the unemployment figures; they're terrifying. A lot of people are out of work. A lot of people are abruptly out of work. And anyway, a lot of people don't have savings, you know, aren't in a situation. There's all these like statistics kind of floating around, but like a lot of people can't even find like $400 in an emergency and so on. So you know, not only are they themselves poor, but they're living in like networks of poor people who's maybe not necessarily even someone you could like borrow money from, whatever. So we're in conditions of already quite widespread systematic poverty, and into this has come this kind of wave of unemployment, along with the like wave of the pandemic, and what that's created a situation where like people just can't pay their rent. So it's like, okay, so like the initial, so like one position on that is like, this is a de facto rent strike. People, thousands and millions of people not paying their rent is de facto a rent strike, and it kind of doesn't matter in some way if they refer to it as a rent strike or not. So that would be one like absolute, that like on a kind of spectrum of possible positions would be like a rent strike is, and that was one that I think I initially took myself. I was like, okay, a rent strike is just people like not paying their rent. We have a rent strike, and that was kind of like to try, and I guess that does come from a kind of like insurrectionist or whatever, or spontaneous kind of tendency within myself or whatever. I'm not a very systematic person, so obviously I'm attracted to kind of explosive like moments or whatever, as conceptually as well as in my life. And but then the other end of that would be a kind of something, the concept that I heard expressed by the very wonderful tenant organizer Gerald Smith, who was a former Black Panther, and he was very involved in the Harlem rent strikes of 63 to 65. And he said he did a talk that was organized by Tank, which is like a Bay Area tenant union, and which I'm sure many of you are aware of, and he said poverty is not a strike. And so, you know, which I was really struck by. Okay, so that was in the moment where I was still like, okay, it just is a strike because people aren't paying or whatever. And he's like, poverty isn't a strike. And it struck me that, of course, wait, I have this like literally whatever. So to ask how poverty can be made into a politics is only to restate the usual question: how should we fight? So like, I think, and the fact is that most tenant organizers, when they've worked on rent strikes before, rent strikes have a certain kind of character, which is that they're against an individual landlord. They may be around specific kind of aspects of the building, like, for example, like repairs not being done. That was what the Harlem rent strike was kind of the genesis of the Harlem rent strike, was these like under-maintained buildings or whatever. And now what's happening is actually is a situation where the antagonist almost isn't really the individual landlord at all, or the individual landlord is only any kind of pressure put on the individual landlord is only a means to put pressure on the state. So that's the sense in which you could refer to this as like a general rent strike, as some organizers have begun to do, is that it's the antagonist isn't like a landlord or like a corrupt or, you know, like landlord corruption or like landlord as individuals or whatever, but is the state itself. And of course there's a huge overlap between the state and landlords, right? Because you know, as you see in the case of someone like Cuomo, who's the New York governor, who's being like completely mystifyingly like feted by people right now as he presides over basically a crime against humanity. I mean, whatever, obviously that's a contentious category, but presides over this disgusting situation in prisons and so on. But anyway, but he's very like, you know, like in the pocket of real estate, and it's quite common because and this is like the wider the broader like context of this is like in post 2008 crisis, there's been this kind of like massive and I guess specifically since like 2012 there's been this kind of reinflation of like property prices, and the property bubble has like continued to be maintained. So one of the few like sources of kind of spurious fictitious capital or whatever right now is kind of property. So there's a huge like overlaps between the state and real estate. Anyway, Trump himself as a landlord, etc., and a property developer. So I guess a property developer as well. But like yeah, so this is a special moment of rent strike that isn't maybe so initially it isn't maybe so familiar to a lot of tenant organizers, right? So there was a certain amount of hesitance on the part of some tenant organizers who were like, well, this isn't really like what we've seen before. This isn't like a rent strike where the object is to kind of get the landlord into court and then kind of like push for repairs, or and it might not even be what happened. The horizon might even be bigger than what happened in the case of the Harlem rent strikes, which Gerald Smith described as having kind of limited but kind of real success in the form of like 30 houses that became like tenant run, that became co-ops or whatever. Although, you know, all these categories are complex, like, you know, the situations where co-ops are also landlords, and that can produce its own kind of internal tensions and so on. So yeah, but in general, you know, like the horizons have previously been that maybe tenants can themselves manage their own homes, and the horizons have now kind of expanded and made even kind of new legislative possibilities become apparent. Like, for example, like rent cancellation, at least for the duration of the pandemic, and kind of rent forgiveness of, you know, forgiveness of arrears and so on, have become like real possibilities, and they're being really pushed against. In some ways, the right has more faith in us than we do, because the right tends to really like push against even quite common. I mean, in some senses, rent cancellation right now would be like a very common sense, like pandemic, like emergency policy or whatever, that you'd imagine they could just kind of roll back or lift as soon and go back to normal as soon as the pandemic was over. But it seemed, or you know, like if the recovery ever comes. But in fact, I think there is a real concern on the part of the state that these kind of concessions will become permanent, right? Because people tend to really like it when they get stuff for free. And this is kind of what happened in the UK, where you get like a really broad, which has a universalized free at point of care taxation funded health service. And people really like it across the political spectrum and they don't want it to be taken away. So there's kind of similar fears for something like, you know, like, oh, if people suddenly can live in their houses free, maybe rent will become completely denaturalized, and on the and people won't want to pay rent anymore. And on the radical end of tenant organizing, that is kind of, you know, that is what we want. The full decommodification of housing. So it's no longer housing, you know, the provision of housing is no longer profit making, and that would be a complete transformation of current social conditions. And on a wider scale of like, what are the kind of ultimate possibilities of I mean, maybe not ultimate possibilities of rent strike, but I asked this question of a couple of tenant organizers I was talking to yesterday, and I was quite moved by the answer of one of them, this person, Don Ryan, who's an organizer in LA, and he talked about this kind of the kind of vision of tenant organizing, because the base, okay, so it's like, how do you go on rent strike, right? A lot of people are kind of like crashing into this situation, have no idea how to politically organize, I've never really done this stuff before. No, it's like, how do you you know, I mean, we're all like learning so much right now, and it's like, the question is like, how do you organize? And it's like, well, you talk to your neighbors. Okay, a lot of people don't talk to their neighbors. There's a million reasons we don't talk to our neighbors. Like, we're busy, we lead this like network lives, we do, like, I mean, you know, in my case, like, I travel a lot, etc. So so you already, you know, so it's kind of seems like, I think it's quite easy on some level to be like, yeah, rent strike, and then when it comes to the actual like detail of that, it's often like you have to interact with a stranger, like, and then when you interact with a stranger, like all these like massive like social conditions are kind of very present suddenly, right? Or the ways we kind of allied, or we kind of soften the edges of problems of like, you know, like various forms of segregation, like race, age, class, like whatever, these kind of ways you know, we tend to sort of gravitate towards people, I mean, at least people like me are kind of like the non-essential professional class, so whatever, we tend to gravitate towards like people who are similar to us, and that's not, and you know, and some of those reasons are completely sympathetic, like you know, Don also gave the example of like young queer kids who like leave, you know, who like maybe like left home and left kind of like the situation of kind of neighborliness in order to kind of like enter into a process of like self-becoming and to kind of avoid certain forms of violence or whatever. So home is really complex, neighbors are complex, talking to strangers is complex, and you know, and we're just going to have to try and move through that, like in all its complexity, and like without, in some ways, like I think the problem I realized how many of the kind of new realizations I'm having in the pandemic are actually just old realizations. Like I was really very early in Trump, I was like very like horrified by this, like one of the worst political slogans in history, I think, which is like love Trump's hate, which had like so many things wrong with it. And what, you know, the main thing sort of, you know, like syntactically wrong with it. It's like, why do you have an anti-Trump slogan that has the word Trump in it? I mean, I just really thought that was I was like aesthetically offended by that. But I think the other maybe more like conceptually interesting problem is that with that is that, you know, these kind of categories like love and hate kind of tend to be sort of like can be deployed in a way that's almost like sentimental, and that's not that it's like ethically bad to be sentimental, it just doesn't always equip you for the kind of reality of living, right? Because you know, the fact is, when we enter into collectivity and solidarity, we enter into kind of quite a jagged situation of you know, of pleasure, because it's such a pleasure to get to know people and be around people, you know, like I really miss that, but like but also difficulty, and this is, you know, and the pandemic really is a moment that I think is really revealing how this kind of play between like the desire for closeness and the desire for distance, and the way those are kind of like we manage that across all our relationships and social activities or whatever. So yeah, and this has been coming up, and just to kind of get into the, because kind of, I guess, getting to the end of my 40 minutes, I guess I have like 10, 11 minutes left or something. But yeah, to get into kind of some mutual aid stuff like that. So in some kind of mutual aid, so this is really evident in mutual aid. Obviously, it's like it's evident in the case of rent strike, but it's very heavily evident in mutual aid. Mutual aid is, I mean, I actually don't know all the ins and outs of the like history of the concept, but it's like a kind of more like anarchist end kind of the political spectrum kind of concept, but it's kind of had this like massive take up, like suddenly like millions of people are involved in different kinds of mutual aid efforts, and that's kind of in some cases supplementing existing mutual aid organizations, which often come from kind of Black and brown communities and communities that are generally already under kind of crisis conditions, so they have ongoing kind of mutual aid efforts or whatever, and then there's also these kind of new ones springing up for like suddenly unemployed like service workers in New York, for example, and these kind of new attempts to kind of help each other or whatever, and you know, and there are and that is a sphere of quite high organizational, or quite high sort of inter-organization tension or whatever. So, you know, like obviously you have demographic differences between the different kinds of mutual aid organizations that then become potential sites of conflict. And in some cases, there's conflicts around if mutual aid should be like political or not. So there's kind of and I guess it sort of depends on what the sphere of mutual aid is. So I think there's some, I think that's also what's really interesting about the situation, where the kind of paradigm seems to be around like care or survival, is it does really offer this kind of lure of a kind of like totally apolitical sphere of just like, you know, it's like people just need food, so you should get them some food. That's not politics, that's just helping. Or like, or, you know, people just need PPE, that's just something they need. So a lot of these kind of things are happening either under a kind of quite liberal, in quite a liberal way, or they're happening kind of as if apolitically, which comes to the same thing, right? If you don't like have a, if you don't like, I mean, in a sense, if you don't have a politics, you just fall into the kind of existing like normative politics, which tends towards a kind of like centrist liberal kind of vibe or whatever. So in, you know, and in some cases, and in some cases, mutual aid groups have kind of split across along kind of like those lines. You know, some people are like, I don't want to make this political, by which they tend to mean I don't want to make this like a left wing kind of issue or whatever, or set of issues. And in other cases, so there's been kind of splits in mutual aid groups along those lines already. I think this is actually fine. I think that's fine. I feel like it's actually like because of the kind of like high degree of tension involved in these kind of this form of, maybe that's the wrong way to say it. I just think it's like, you know, for example, I mean, this is a really crass example, but like obviously like you know, extremely racist old people probably still need someone to like get them groceries and stuff, like they, you know, so it's like, I don't personally want to do that, like I don't want to do that, but I think there probably are people who want to do that, and I think it's fine for people to be operating in there within their circles of their own kind of needs and interests or whatever. Although there is a hope that also like through kind of politicization of mutual aid, it's and kind of, you know, and building networks between kind of like mutual aid groups that have like different kind of points of unity between them, even if they don't necessarily agree on everything. And that's been happening a lot recently because there is a kind of like speed of the crisis that's kind of necessitating, like there isn't necessarily time to kind of, so that's been happening, for example, with this this kind of international rent strike, or this attempt to kind of internationally network different like rent strike movements, like in the first phase of that, which was, you know, like early pandemic, like early March or something. It was like, I mean, time is so long now and short, but there was some idea that maybe people would like collectively work out demands. There was, I don't know if anyone saw the like 5 demands thing that was kind of circulating. I'm actually not 100% sure who put that out originally, but there was that kind of idea. There kind of isn't time, I think, for the people have, or what's at least in this one example, what ended up happening was that rather than work through specific demands, which were quite different, so like the Spanish rent strikers were really into like UBI, universal basic income, and wanted to have that as a demand. That's something that's potentially on the agenda there and it's like possible for them. I think there's real arguments around if it is actually so important to kind of fight for UBI, or if it might be better to kind of press for like free stuff or like in-kind benefits or whatever, such as Medicare for all and so on. And that might actually be a more sort of like opposite terrain of struggle or whatever. There's no time to work out these kind of things, but people do want to be in solidarity rent striking. So people have kind of like develop more kind of like points of unity that kind of allow them to like loosely network rather than necessarily coming up with like fully institutionalized forms. And in general, this moment is quite interesting because it is a kind of like, I feel like this is a really like high left unity moment, and so back to the context of rent strike, there's traditionally quite a lot of tension, and this is also something I don't think I didn't understand initially. I've really learned a lot of this stuff in the past couple of months or whatever, that is that there's quite a lot of tension, that there are in some cases political differences between organizations that understand themselves as about housing and organizations that are framed around tenants. Okay, so that's like so housing organizations tend to be more policy led, they're often like non-profits and so on, and tenant organizing tends to be more autonomous from non-profits and kind of not and more autonomous from the state. And so, and where they are kind of pushing for legislation, they're not doing it but I mean, they might push for legislation, but that would be through like exerting kind of external pressure or whatever. So that's historically been a potential kind of zone of difference or whatever, or there's been some differences or hostility even in some cases between like tenant organizers and like non-profit or like housing level kind of organizations, and that's not, that's probably that difference is like at its like least right now. It's like it's like the contradictions are at their slackest or whatever, and at they're kind of, they're quite reduced, those contradictions. So actually there's a possibility of like a really kind of like mass mobilized and unified kind of movement towards getting in place some of the legislative things we're going to need for the aftermath of the pandemic, where, because we're obviously also in like huge economic crisis or whatever, and there's the possibility of mass evictions, and people really have to be organized in a way that resists mass evictions or whatever. And what we're going to do that through is neighborliness. And I think I've kind of got into the habit of referring to the, but and the other thing I think is really important is that kind of mutual aid and tenant organizing get like linked together. And I think something that has been happening related to the kind of like apolitical nature of some mutual aid organizing, or the kind of fantasy of apolitical mutual aid. Of course, it's not real. There's always a politics or whatever, but because of the fantasy, you can somehow rid mutual aid of any politics, and it's all just being a kind of informal food delivery service or whatever. In some cases, mutual aid groups have kind of like have been like not that into the idea of like helping, of also directing people towards like a local tenant union, or like helping them form a tenant union or whatever. They haven't also wanted to do that. They haven't seen that as part of the purview of mutual aid, and I think that's a shame. I think that they should be as networked as possible. I think what we're working on is a kind of movement for, I mean, this, to be honest, there's a reason so I've been conceiving of a lot of this stuff in terms of like a movement for homes and building a home. Like, how are we going to make the world a home? It's not, you know, and obviously that's coming from like my own sense of homelessness, kind of, you know. I'm currently stuck in England. I'm someone who anyways, like, you know, moved around a lot of like quite a weirdly like unstable kind of like life for, you know, various reasons since childhood or whatever. So obviously for me that's like very moving, the idea of like finally we can have a home. Maybe for other people there's other ways of kind of conceiving of this or whatever it could also be, because I think a world which is a real home could also be one which is a safer place for wandering or whatever. There's a part in I mean, this is really like, we're in the far out horizon now, we're so far from this, but we can do, you know, again, we have to be able to like build it in the here and now in order to kind of like perceive it as a possibility. So I guess we're both far from it and inside it or whatever. But I really love this. I mean, it's kind of like a very like 80s feminist book called Women on the Edge of Time, where this it was just like this futuristic whatever, this woman's like traveling between the 80s New York present and the present of the book and the future. And there's a scene where in the future where she's hearing about the kind of like totally non-patriarchal, non-violent condition of the future society, and she thinks to herself, like, she imagines like being on a dark road late at night and seeing some men get out of a van and feeling only curiosity or whatever. So a world with a world that was a home would also, I think, you know, we could wander more easily in it potentially or whatever. So I guess if wandering is a more beautiful image to you than the idea of a home, then we could also think of it as like a movement for safe wandering or something. But there's a general sort of movement for homes that's kind of extraordinarily in a place of extraordinary unity right now, that's going to then be that's going to be in a position of dealing with these like waves of attempted evictions. And this does seem quite likely. I was talking to a wonderful organizer, Ricky from Michigan, who's talking about how there was like a 2-day gap, that the governor didn't like renew there was like a 2-day gap in the eviction moratorium, in which landlords were already putting in we're already trying to evict people, which they can't really do right now, and eviction courts are going to be backed up for quite a long time. So like potentially there's a kind of a time advantage if nothing else, but there does seem to be a real like will on the part of landlords and their various like politician allies to try and push through evictions as soon as possible. And those are going to happen at different moments in different parts of the country. So the moratoriums are kind of like coming due at different times, obviously. Like and another aspect of the situation that's quite striking right now is like almost what seems like I always get confused with the term federalism, because it seems like you can use it to mean either, but it's like, anyway, it's a complete fragmentation, the prospect of a really fragmented situation. So what you might be facing is extraordinarily different conditions in different parts of the country as states are sort of scrambling to kind of do things themselves or whatever. And sometimes literally, I mean, I just saw this news about FEMA stealing, I can't remember which state, but a state had managed to acquire like a shipment of PPE that FEMA then like stole. So I think there's it's a really odd moment in terms of the kind of like entire sort of like form of the political am I here? Oh my God, I'm so sorry. But that is life right now. It's broken like a link. but being made whole. Okay, sorry. So I lost the thread. I'm going to zoom out to something I guess I'm kind of over, but I'm just going to end with a sort of like mixed bag of things that I didn't get around to saying earlier. So what we're looking at is obviously, okay, so there's an initial kind of moment of like a kind of early pandemic moment of like this idea that we're all going to be unified by facing the same threat. Like clearly, inevitably it turns out that like poor people of color are the main kind of victims and so on, and like rich people are to some extent like protected, like the usual, and it's also very frustrating, like not one of the like fascist leaders has yet died of whatever, sorry, maybe it's bad to like wish ill on people, but like whatever, you're saying this kind of situation where there obviously are like massive differences between how the virus is affecting different people, but there is also a kind of interpenetration of different kind of social forms that's being like really like literalized. I mean, it's like early on it almost felt like it was some like communist sci-fi film or whatever, and I was really struck by this point that Mike Davis made in the Jacobin podcast that he did a while ago that probably a lot of you listened to. That's really good, listen to it if you haven't. But he talks about how he talks about the current global situation. He talks about this current global situation as one of triage, where people have been kind of essentially like huge swathes of the world have kind of been like triaged as like not worth living or whatever. This is the triage is like, obviously the thing they do in hospitals where they kind of like organize, and it was developed initially in Napoleonic warfare, and it's like this thing that you kind of it's originally a term from like the wool industry or whatever, and that you basically sort people into kind of like severely ill you can't help them, and or like moderately ill and like likely to survive, and it's kind of the sort of horror conditions of a completely overstretched health service involve a kind of high degree of like triage or whatever. And so Mike Davis talks about the kind of triaging of the world into people who deserve to survive and people who don't or whatever, and he says that unlike climate change, which is more heavily affecting people who've already been triaged into a position of to some extent like worthless to capital or whatever, although obviously like worthwhile to themselves and their loved ones, but he says unlike that, the quality of disease, of pandemic is genuinely kind of interpenetrates everywhere. And he gives the example of the kind of model of the Victorian, or the model of the kind of 19th century cities of Western Europe, Northwestern Europe, that were like based on the idea that the wind goes in a certain direction. So you build all the poor people live on the east end, and then the rich people live to the west, which is like less subject to kind of wind patterns that blow smoke in that direction or whatever. And so they felt very protected and safe from these kind of malign things coming from the poor people. And then a cholera epidemics happened, and they just like blew through all the different parts of town. And that was the time that public sanitation programs became sort of politically feasible and even urgent, and started to happen, as a kind of self-protective realization that there's a kind of interconnection of all being through, we're all like vectors of disease. We all have these like vulnerable bodies that potentially could become sick and die, and which is obviously an insight that's been very worked through by like theorists of disability, and in quite extraordinary ways in some cases. So people, we've been working on this, but the big we, so and I think this is so striking because so you get this moment where you have this completely ignorant ruling class that thinks it can wall itself off from disease. I mean, we're now like back in this, right? Like, so this is a ruling class that comes from a culture that completely forgot the most basic principles of self-care and care for others, that didn't even know about washing your hands. This is a culture that had to rediscover that before you lay your hands on like a newborn infant or someone's like sick body, you should go to them with clean hands. This is a society that had to like relearn even that. So this is really the question of sickness and contagion has been somehow become so scrambled by a deeply I guess a deeply homeless social form. And what that's led to is a kind of situation where care has been, to go back to the question of care has been consigned to both a kind of private realm, like a kind of so it's both an inside and an outside, right? Care is both in this kind of like messy interior of the home or of your own kind of like like self or whatever, and it's something that's kind of external to requirements, it's external to capital, it's a thing you do sort of like on top of the other stuff that's actually important or whatever. And this is the conventional capitalist understanding of care, which I think makes this moment so striking, because it's kind of an inversion of that. It's like a difficult inversion of that. And it's so interesting to me in that and I'll try and wrap up in a second, but that one of the primary sites of the first outbreak of the pandemic in the States was in a care home, in an elder care home in Washington State. And what you have there is people, I don't know the specific conditions of in every case of all the care homes where there's been outbreaks, but in many of them there's extremely low wage workers who are caring for people who have been, according to who, you know, have been cannot be, there's not the capacity within their family structures and their structures of love to care for them as they grow old and die and become kind of surplus to kind of, you know, they're no longer kind of value generating as people or whatever. And you've had some kind of really explicit statements of the kind of like uselessness of the elderly coming from right-wing politicians or whatever, as if they're, you know, discardable or disposable in some way. So so it's really striking that one of the sites of this kind of failed care that's kind of been like almost like privatized in the sense of also becoming kind of secret and like hidden from view, hasn't even, in some cases the deaths in care homes haven't even been included, in many cases haven't been included in official statistics. So this really gives us a sense of what the current kind of conditions of care are that have to be kind of completely revolutionized. And of course there's a strong relationship between that and all the kind of, you know, global histories of colonialism and as a force of and slavery as forces of homelessness. And for example, it's extremely evident in the UK context, where like Jamaican nurses are hugely important to the NHS, and there's a long history of like Jamaican nursing that stretches back to the, you know, the plantation period, where there were where like, you know, white kind of plantation owners would be like tended to and cared for by Jamaican women, kind of as kind of like a maternal sort of nurse figures. And now these are the same immigrants, same people who have been cast as sort of like, yeah, like surplus kind of immigrant labor and are kind of dying of COVID and in some cases being deported and so on. So we have this like extremely activated histories of care and the kind of problem of how to like deal with care in a system that understands itself only in terms of its production of value and isn't turned care itself into a site of that. So just to wrap up, and oh god, so many more concrete things I didn't get into, but maybe we could get into them in the questions. Yeah, so I wanted, so this is mostly quotes, but I'll just end on a couple of quotes and like one set of thoughts. So as the epidemiologist Rod Wallace, I feel like it's really nice right now how everyone's been like, there's a Marxist epidemiologist, and like suddenly his like stuff is everywhere or whatever, but it's cool that there's like a Marxist everything. But so as the epidemiologist Rod Wallace and colleagues put it on the subject of how to avoid the even more damaging pandemics of the future that will follow unless we collectively change our fate, they say, a successful intervention keeping any one of the many pathogens queuing up across the agroeconomic circuit from killing 1 billion people must walk through the door of a global clash with capital and its local representatives, however much any individual foot soldier of the bourgeoisie attempts to mitigate the damage. The way out is nothing short of birthing a world, or perhaps more along the lines of returning back to Earth. I guess this is whatever. It will also help solve, sleeves rolled up, many of our most pressing problems. None of us stuck in our living rooms from New York to Beijing, or worse, mourning our dead, want to go through such an outbreak again. And I'm sure no one working right now wants to, and you know, vulnerable to virus wants to do it either. And it also kind of, I've repurposed a line that Esther Perel used in her recent, like, how to not feel crazy in lockdown in many different relational situations. She's the famous couples therapist podcaster. So speaking on the subject of the communism à deux, communism for two of the couple form, that's my flourish. I don't think she would see it like that. She said, quote, "In a moment like this of prolonged uncertainty, you need both the experience of imminent danger meeting the experience of unabated possibilities for the future. They live together. One is the awareness of death and dying and loss, and the other is the awareness of recreation and living on." For those, so we can kind of grasp this quite terrible moment as a moment of deep grief and a strange distorted glimpse of what what a post-pandemic communism, or whatever you would like to call it, might look like. And these represent a first, these represent some I was going to say first step, but continuing steps in the collective attempts that are never well favored, that are never guaranteed, that are always necessary to ensure that the systems that produce the conditions for this moment of collective heartbreak never come again, and that we move forward in our forever work of making a home of the world. So we can end there and do some questions maybe.
That's so great. Thank you so much, Hannah. I know it's so hard to do this in this unilateral space of the screen, but that was extremely resonant. Thank you. So far we have one question, and please, anybody type in your questions to the Q&A, and what I'll do is I'm just going to try to read it through as best as I can. There might be some confusion just because the difference between typing and reading is clear, but yeah, we can try to suss it out as best we can. So this is from an anonymous attendee. They say, regarding the way you frame friction that arises in rent strike conversations with neighbors as totally understandable and something that needs to be worked through. How to resolve something that emerges where maybe lefty college educated tenants approach working class neighbors to strike, but are maybe in less precarious positions than their neighbors. For example, at the end of an eviction moratorium, which finds all of the neighbors getting evicted, but the college kids can move to their parents' house or have home savings to find a new place, while the more true blue working class people are left without resources. So the question is it ethical for rent strikes to be introduced into a building with the kind of diversity of college kids and working class tenants are inhabiting that space?
This is such an important question. I've been thinking about this so much. I think so. I kind of got like a little bit schooled on it talking to these two tenant organizers the other day so I guess because it does seem like quite quickly what this will move into is conditions of like potential mass eviction that might actually, in some cases, maybe not everywhere, but in some cases might come down to literally just like protect the block, kind of like, how do you like literally not let people come into a building? And then you kind of imagine the sorts of, we've seen the kinds of, we've seen in the kind of Ferguson era or whatever, we've seen the kinds of like horrific, like totally militarized repression that happens when there's kind of mass struggle that's predominantly Black people. So I kind of expressed like a fear to them about that, and they kind of responded with I think the kind of the accurate point that these things, the more radical struggles have in fact been led by working class Black people and poor people of color have actually not, they've not been, so I think that's kind of a weird thing that happens when we try and think this stuff through, because I guess it's hard not to kind of like really like systematize things or whatever, and to kind of keep some like liquid flowing through the like, like keep flesh on the skeleton of the concepts, kind of, because as much as it is true that obviously poor Black people in everywhere, but especially in America, are like radically vulnerable to state violence, but there's also the fact that has been the font of most kind of revolutionary political activity. So I think to sort of like ascribe that to like, sort of like is maybe not actually the case, and that's part of a kind of, there's been a sort of propaganda campaign around that. It's a little bit like how when people think about ending the Vietnam War, it's like, oh, these like hippie white college students kind of ended the Vietnam War. It's like no, the Viet Cong won the Vietnam War and forced America to leave, so I think so that's the concern, but at the same time, like I think that on the other side of that, I think something that I was really naive about when I first was exploring the kind of like rent strike and tenant organizing and so on in the pandemic era or whatever, was that initially I was like really impatient with all these organizers who were kind of like cautioning against rent strike and saying like, hey, like maybe you want to first like individually negotiate with your landlord and like let's talk about this, and we don't really know what we're doing, and like so on. A lot of those actually, yeah, it's true, like represented like a lot of like older Black and brown people who were like traditionally like, who just have more, who feel more vulnerable to displacement, who maybe have more like actual like social ties. I think there is a way that a certain type of like person, like I to an extent include myself in this, like is quite, some people are just more mobile than others, right? And I think when you say college students, you're kind of referring to like people who are like to some extent like who can like move around more easily. They maybe don't have childcare, they're not like specifically attached to like jobs in the same way, like whatever, that they have a different relationship to like all kinds of labor in a way that they're kind of like less sort of like tied to a place or whatever. And I think that is real. And it did turn out that a lot of the tenant unions that were more initially cautious about rent strike were reflecting that as their base. But they've actually changed them. They've changed their positions now. I think it's actually now rent strike has become like quite a conventional position. And the fact is, again, also in terms of like unemployment figures, so when we talk about like millions of people now unemployed, a lot of those people are people of color, a lot of those people are obviously working class, and so that's actually the main like base of a possible rent strike, is already those people. And it's actually but on the other hand, I do think there is a role for people who are sort of allies or sympathizers who maybe themselves are still kind of in a relatively financially stable situation. Like I think if anyone was hoping to really prove to themselves the strength of their like allyship or their kind of like solidarity, or like however you want to think about that, maybe those concepts are a bit different, but like now is a great time to prove that by going on rent strike. You're very well protected. Most places have some kind of eviction moratorium in place. Like there's all sorts of ways that this is like there's a much more like unified kind of like mass defense possibility than usual. So I think it's actually maybe potentially a good time for the sort of more like the people for whom the stakes aren't as high, or maybe still have a certain amount of income, to kind of like consider if they can. I mean, obviously not everyone can for all sorts of reasons, but if you're in a position to rent strike, it might actually be a kind of pretty good moment to do that. I do think, I just think I wouldn't want to, I totally like the spirit of what you're saying. I really agree with, and I think, and especially when talking to like non-Black organizers, I would, or like to white organizers, I might have that in the back of my mind as really like something I want to like check them for or whatever, or make sure they get or whatever. But at the same time, let's not any of us like foreclose the possibilities of like truly radical, like in like completely visionary struggle coming exactly from poor Black people and poor Indigenous people, like whatever, like poor people, basically. That's who has to do it. I mean, it's like I'm in this to the extent that I am myself a poor person. I mean, that's weird because I'm an artist, so like sometimes I'm like, oh, I've just made art money or whatever, but it's like, yeah, there is a way. It's like that's the thing to commit to, kind of. And so I agree with you that everything has to be tested against that, but at the same time like not to the point that we like close down anything that involves risk, right? We have to be able to take risks. We're under because we're in so much danger, right? It's literally like, I feel like, it's like we've got to get out of hell, kind of like the door. It's like the Indiana Jones movie, and the door is closed, and and like the gate is coming down, and people are like, well, maybe it's dangerous to like roll under it or whatever. It's like, I don't know, probably, but I do think it's like pretty extreme right now, so it probably is the moment for the more intense end of the tactics, and that's especially as things are becoming like just like literally possible in the political mainstream, that would just like, if someone had said to you like 5 months ago, like Trump, whatever, I don't know what time is anymore, 3 months ago, like Trump will be like giving people money for free, you'd be like, that's crazy, like whatever. It's like this, we're in the possibilities are shifting like so intensely right now, that I think we shouldn't also get too committed to like, well, this is how things were, so they're going to have to continue to be like that just for now. And we have this like really like almost like oceanic feeling. It does, it feels like just being constantly like influenced by these forces at the moment. And maybe that's already kind of lessening a bit as the kind of sci-fi-ness of the feeling lessens, and it just becomes like, what's happening? But I think it's like good to sort of keep channeling that and keep working with that as an energy for now. Because it's like, it's like, are we going to live or die? Like, it's like we're in the lobby of the apocalypse. They're checking us in. They're asking us for like a ID or whatever. It's like we could still turn around and walk out the door, but we are in the lobby of the apocalypse right now. I mean, obviously I'm using these terms in a really, because I keep saying like the apocalypse is always and forever, and then I use it as if it's also to come. But it's both. It's just how it is. I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And it's absolutely right. And kind of harks back to that idea of building a home, of creating homefulness rather than homelessness. And it's there's this, somebody wrote in e-Connor, it's not really a question, but they said, I love this idea of the movement of the homes. There's a line in this Chris Nealon poem that imagines the future post-crisis that says, buildings were either shelter or they weren't. Yeah. I mean, that's not really a question, but
Yeah, there's like, what are the types of spaces now? I really thought I had this, so my first experience of the reality of this, I mean, in a sort of more like my own direct experience way, was I was in Italy for an exhibition mid-February. I hate traveling for work, so I was really mad about being there. So you can imagine how mad I am now, but I can't go home for a while. But anyway, I was in Italy, and sorry, I know it's ungrateful, but that's just how I felt about it. But like, for this show, and then it opened and then had to close 2 days later because of the pandemic, and it was still somehow like, oh, weird thing that's happening in Italy, and then like whatever. But anyway, so the show was, but I spent some time there like installing and whatever, so I'm familiar with it as an art space. And then I saw, and then I got an email from the curator, and I heard that it's now 100, they turned it into 100 bed intensive like ICU into a hospital. So I was like, okay, what, like, places are either hospitals, shelters, or what's the other thing? Fuck, it's like the categories of what things can be have just like radically reduced or whatever. And there's like zones of infection, I guess, as well. Oh, the thing I think is really important in terms of the like, I don't know, wait, I'm not sure if this is directly relevant actually, but something that felt important in terms of the reopening the economy discourse or whatever. It's just, I think it's, maybe everyone understands this. Sometimes I feel like it fades from view in how we speak about it, though, but just that they literally can't, in the sense that what the lockdown is about is managing. It's a bit like the kind of like no deal Brexit versus like like managed Brexit or whatever. It's like crashing out of the social, because as if a lot of people get sick, people will themselves start. This is basically what happened, to an extent, what happened in Iran, where there wasn't a lot of like top-down government instruction because they were really not on top of it, and then people just sort of self-organized quarantine conditions. They just did it. People just do it because they don't want to die. So what they're doing with the lockdown is kind of like state managing something that would otherwise just be out of control. And different forms of this has been happening in different directions. Like in China, they sort of like pre-delegated like local, I mean, China's anyway super like locally organized, like Communist Party is like organized down to the block level, so that is actually just like a social form they have available that they can use for stuff. But also there was some like there was some disorganized like blockades and whatever, and people just kind of self-organizing stuff that wasn't like through the kind of like like direct sort of like authority structures or whatever. And they sort of like approved those. They were like, oh, if people want to organize those lockdowns in whatever way, they can just do that. So there's a way the state has to kind of keep ahead of what could be just like a completely chaotic, like I think people just like totally refusing to do stuff or whatever, which is starting to happen in some industries in some cases. I mean, that's literally what you're saying with these like walkouts and protests in some cases. So I think, yeah, it's not somehow it feels like that's, it's really important that that's like the ground kind of. It's not that everyone can be magically made to go back. There is no way people can be made to go back to it. That's actually just not that. And that's obviously why we're seeing these like extraordinary concessions happen. They're going to try and claw them all back, and it has to just, and I think it's another really important point that I didn't mention, I didn't get to, but like was is that what's happening right now with the lockdown. I mean, again, probably everyone knows this, but I just sometimes see it like a little bit like discursively missing or whatever, that what we're doing is by like in many cases either staying at home or exposing ourselves to disease, is that we are compensating the state for a failure. Like the deal is, the point of the state is that they kind of like mediate and they manage between capital and labor to some extent. That's part of its like historical form in some way, or that's just like justification, like ethically or whatever. They're supposed to make sure people stay alive or whatever. They're not doing that, and they're not managing to even like reproduce the labor force in a way that means that they can avoid another like massive economic crisis in an already vulnerable system. So they're not really doing their job at all. So then what we're doing to compensate for that is we're like staying at home or potentially getting sick, whatever. So we don't owe them anything. This is just like about adequate, like not really even adequate payment for that like massive task. Like everyone's just like got a job which is like staying at home or risking getting sick. That's your job right now, kind of. So I feel like in that, but whatever. So I think it's maybe there's some, I mean, not that like language is where these things ultimately get worked out, but maybe it's good to have a certain kind of precision about like what we're dealing with, because it somehow veers in all sorts of directions sometimes.
Yeah, that's absolutely, I mean, language is a complicated thing, especially coming from a field in the arts. We're constantly discussing these things and very rarely, trying to transform our words and our conversations into actual actions, like walking out of a museum or organizing labor within arts workers organizations.
Yeah, or like, I don't know, maybe people should be experimenting with like propaganda. I don't know. I feel like it's really like, whatever you want to try, just try it. I mean, I'm really interested in things that my understanding is that some organizers are whatever. I mean, sorry, I never know how, like, whatever, like DSA are trying to like place people in like essential work, you know, industries or whatever. I don't know. It's like there's, I think things that are a bit like out there feel like completely on the table in terms of like any like embarrassing thing you felt like doing in terms of like what you feel your skill set is. I think it's worth kind of working on right now, just to feel like you tried, kind of.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings me to our talk with Astra Taylor and Jacques LaRoche. They had compiled on the Debt Collective's website a whole list of every rent strike and every action that was happening globally, or they're trying to.
Wow, that seems really hard. It seems really hard. Like, how are they even trying to do that? I should get in touch with them. Because I do think, okay, because that's the other thing, is I feel like, because I'm not really, I should have said this more. Obviously, like, what I was trying to imply with a lot of my comments was that this has to be, to an extent, this has to be led as much as possible by either directly affected people and or like people long-term working with directly affected people, whether there's a kind of like long-termness or a kind of priority to that kind of mode of struggle. But for people like me who just whatever, like do like art stuff, whatever, I think it's kind of a good time to do just like admin and like general helping. And I think in the admin and general helping, and it isn't boring. I don't know why people say it's boring all the time. It's really interesting and fun and cool. And I think it's because it's like sad. Maybe it's sad, but it's not boring. But sometimes it can be sad. But I think one of the things that's come up in that is that actually connecting people. There is, because people are so flat out. So anyone who's like already working in a mutual aid kind of thing, people who are like working in like the more like, yeah, who are organizing tenants, who are organizing labor, who are doing like whatever, they're so flat out that literally just like putting people in touch is kind of quite useful right now, I think. So so that kind of project of like, just like, let's just like try and get as many of the rent strikes as possible in a list, it's like, that's pretty good. We have to make, I mean, not to sound like, maybe I'm having some like 90s theory moment, I'm like, networks, they're great, or whatever. It's like in terms of like people connecting and building power in that way, it does seem kind of useful. But also just really hard, because a lot of this is organizers are struggling to catch up with what's already happening. So it's like, what would a rent strike list even include? Would it include like everyone who's not paying rent? Because it's like, that's sort of not been quite politically inscribed yet in every case, which is the other big task. So yeah.
Matt had a question too. Let me see. He's curious about how you balance but thinking about both the present and the future, especially when everything feels both day to day for many and days are also blurring together. Just that we're in this kind of new version of temporal fog.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like, I think I was already in that because I lead a really strange life. But I mean, maybe I guess it's not that strange. Maybe I just choose to think it's strange. But like, I'm freelance. I manage my, I don't know, there's some, I mean, apart from the fact I can't hang out with, I mean, I usually like also like constantly hang out with people, so that's really weird to not be constantly hanging out with people. But generally in terms of like I'm distributing my work, it's pretty similar. So I think I'm always in the state of like mild like social collapse internal to my life, or I always feel a bit like that. I also don't impose any routine. Like I guess some people are like artists, but they'll like go to the studio every day. I've never been able to do that. So I think I'm just habituated to a certain kind of like, and I think I'm someone who has quite a long, my personal time sense is quite long. So I was, it was kind of quite a big explicit part of my upbringing was like kind of like long, you know, be like, oh, your mother's angry, it's because of the Holocaust or the internet. Sorry, the thing I was saying, which was just that I like the idea that we used to maybe live for 500 years and now we live this like pathetically reduced form of human life, and what we need to do is get back to, you know, like an adequate length of life to like do all the stuff. And it's kind of fine, you know, sometimes it's like everything's confusing, you're a bit dazed, like, well, that's just what's going on. There's this, you know, it's like it would be nice to work towards a relation to time that had room for feelings in it. If you're feeling like oppressed by the fact you have to remember it's Tuesday, like, I don't know, maybe it's not a big deal. But that would be the self-help version of this talk. But I guess it's not an exact answer. Yeah, thank you for the question though. That was, I hadn't thought about it in those terms.
Excellent. Maybe we should wait for a couple more minutes to see if there's any more questions, but I think we are nearing the end of things. So this has been extremely helpful and wonderful, and I'm very excited to re-review everything on the video afterwards. So we'll see if you're okay. I can send you the video, and you can tell me whether or not it's okay to post it.
Oh my God, I won't be able to watch it. I will have to think of a third party system or whatever where someone else tells me. It's yeah, I don't know. But thank you. It was weird but nice. So, sorry for smoking. Don't smoke. Apart from it does make you 4 times less likely to get severe COVID. So also maybe consider smoking. I don't know, everyone's confused. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Do you have any kind of ending remarks or actions that people might take?
It would be cool to, I don't know, I suppose it depends where people are based or where you care about. I think the clemency stuff in New York is really important right now. Like, it's actually just, it's so outrageous. Like Iran released like tens of thousands of prisoners, like China released prisoners, England's released, like everyone else is releasing prisoners, even other states are releasing prisoners. It's so terrible what's happening in New York. So the clemency stuff seems really important to, yeah, to get involved in. Like bail is frustrating in some ways as a thing to donate to, but it's cool because bail funds sort of like, it's like a permanent addition to bail funds because it kind of cycles back into the fund or whatever. So that's a cool thing to donate to. I don't know, I think, yeah, I guess there's a lot of stuff right now, but yeah, and everyone should also, I mean, it's not, I'm not trying to be like, I mean, I'm also like in and out of like frenzied activity in terms of like trying to, yeah, this like revolutionary admin or whatever, and then also sometimes just like feeling sad or not doing much or like going for bike rides, or I don't know, I think it's just like people are kind of, there's also like this kind of hand to mouth like coping thing going on right now, which I think is kind of cool, like that, like long may that continue, you know. And sometimes you're just like, I'm doing whatever, kind of, I'm trying to function, it's like always. But yeah, so I don't mean for this to sound like some like scolding thing of like everyone must immediately go out and like exhaust themselves like doing things, but it's just like slowly, you know, getting yourself into the condition of like, yeah, I want to, like, this is where I want to give my energy. Or if you are already doing that, like, you know, like thinking about like how to balance that as well.
That's excellent. On behalf of everyone here, and I think about 150 people tuned in, so it's pretty great. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to you, and hopefully this will generate more discussions and more actions for the future. So
okay,
really,
thank you so much. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.